Welcome. I'm Tom Tweed from Notre Dame, and it's my honor to introduce our president, Laurie Zoloth, who's the Charles Deering McCormick Professor of Religious Studies at Northwestern, as well as Professor of Medical Humanities and Bioethics at its medical school, an affiliate professor of Haifa University, and most recently, visiting fellow at the University of Cambridge. In a recent interview, Laurie said she hoped that the AER might be more robustly in the world, and she's certainly taken her own advice. Laurie's deeply proud of her family, raising 5 children and enjoying 4 grandchildren, and has tried to fashion a life that creatively enacts the complex heritage passed on by her immigrant Jewish grandparents, devoutly Orthodox on her maternal side and fervently Marxist, at least some, on her father's side. She's remained in some way part a Marxist labor organizer and part Jewish social prophet as she engages the world. And that engagement has taken many forms. Early on, she took to the streets, including as a student activist. Later, she turned to the medical world, working first as a nurse in a neonatal unit, and then turning to her life's work as a professor and consultant on social justice issues in healthcare. Laurie's research and teaching is broader than any summary could fairly represent, but working at the intersection of religious studies, theology, and moral philosophy, and informed by her commitment to Judaism and feminism, Laurie's contributed to conversations about ethics, family, science, and social policy. Much of that research is focused on bioethical issues, including stem cell research, synthetic biology, and AIDS. Her CV has more than 32 chapters and 150 articles. She's also the author of Healthcare and the Ethics of Encounter and co-editor of 5 books, including volumes on religion and bioethics, the embryonic stem cell debate, nanotechnology, and oncofertility. Laurie's been recognized for her teaching and service too, winning teaching awards at 2 institutions and doing more than her share of university service, including directing San Francisco State's program in Jewish Studies and founding the Center for Bioethics, Science, and Society at Northwestern School of Medicine. Beyond the campus gates, Laurie's been president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, and she's been a member of NASA and National Advisory Council and the International Society for Stem Cell Research's Executive Council. She has an impressive record of service to this organization, too, from program unit chair to board member. As vice president, president-elect, and finally president, she's been a passionate voice on many issues, advocating for fair labor practices at conference hotels, for socially responsible investments in our organization's portfolio. And that service has continued in a vivid and effective way at this meeting, as she's asked us to focus on climate change, one of the central moral issues of our time. Today, she'll talk to us about that topic in an address entitled Interrupting Your Life, and Ethics for the Coming Storm. And as she comes to the podium, I hope you'll join me in thanking her for being so robustly in the world and reminding all of us that we're called to do the same. Laurie.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you all for coming. Let's see, first slide. There you go. Okay, I'm going to talk a long time. So before I talk, I'm going to give you a chance to do some scriptural reasoning, to do some work. So here are 2 texts, and I want you to read them, since I'm not handing out paper because it's an environmental conference, right? So read the 2 texts, one from the Quran, one from Hebrew Scripture, a shared Scripture, New Testament, of course, and read these 2 accounts and turn to your neighbor, and you have 5 minutes to think about them and talk about them. Your turn, okay? Go. Okay, and you gotta turn to your actual neighbor. Right? Okay, I want to hear talking. We can model it up here. So if you have
I get you.
I get you. So
Between that.
Okay, colleagues. I love the sound of a study hall. We'll get back to that, I promise. November 2nd, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a report today that said the effects of climate change are already occurring on all continents and across the oceans, saying human influence on the climate system is clear and growing. The gathering risks of climate change are so profound that they reverse generations of progress against poverty and hunger. If greenhouse gas emissions continue at a runaway pace, the groups of scientists and other experts found, society faces food shortages, refugee crises, the flooding of major cities like San Diego, and entire island nations, the mass extinction of plants and animals, and a climate so drastically altered it might become dangerous for people to work or play outside. One, the last place. We are living in the last place. There is no other world for us, no second chance. This one world is so beautiful, with the sweet green willows shushing in the August breeze and the halting diamond turns of water from small plastic sprinklers, the ordinary grace of a swerve of bright white birds, and the spun net of high floating clouds, the blue-green weed called miner's lettuce, abundant in the spring sidewalks of the city, the way that wood rubs dark gold from use, the crack of a hammer clear and high, the sway of each of us on the train in wet wool coats, the old man down the alley whistling a song he learned as a boy, seed time and harvest time, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, always and again. We have covered the earth so we can drive the buses and the cars, made the last place we have a good place for driving around, for working, and so much of the work is good. And here are all the usual things we know. This is a world so clean and easy for people with wealth, so hard and dirty for the poor. The seas are polluted with the nitrogen fertilizer. The forests are chopped up for paper. Species are blinkering out. We know this. We sound the depths, we dig up what is left of life crushed to carbon beneath us, and we burn it. To make important things, really, hospital intensive care units and synthetically derived insulin and steel beams for the new high school. But we burn it for nothing, too, really for vanity and emptiness. And the tracing of that smoke lies over us now, invisible, warming the oceans, then the air, then all of the last place. Nothing about the usual things we know, the essential, terrible injustice of it all, has stopped the burning. In fact, this year, we loaded up the air with carbon more than ever. We have been told clearly this is deadly, and it has not made us change a thing. Our lives continue. seamlessly, lucky. But we have gotten that IPCC warning letter, and for scholars of religion, we hear this as prophecy. A storm is coming. It is already on our own horizon. It has been coming for years. The first mention of the fact that human beings might be changing the nature of the air, the term for weather in Hebrew, came in 1957 right at this place, San Diego, by Roger Revelle, founder of the Scripps Institute at UCSD. Now it's clear he was prescient. So let me first say it in the words of the large and serious consensus body of the scientists who have been researching this issue for the last 30 years, whose chairman came yesterday to speak to us. Human influence on the climate system is unequivocal. Greenhouse gas is the highest level in human history. The changes are unprecedented and will cause long-lasting changes in all components of the climate system, increasingly severe and irreversible impacts for people and ecosystems. And then let me say it plainly. Everything we study takes place in a world in which the climate has been essentially stable and predictable for 10,000 years. Every text written, every idea about faith, every song sung or harvest planted has been created in this last place. We have already changed the world for the next 1,000 years. Now at stake is only how very bad it will be. After this year's AAR, no one can say, "I did not know." And that is my goal here. And my goal as president of the world's largest organization of scholars of religion, as one of America's largest scholarly organizations, as an American bioethicist, I want us to face the central moral imperative of our time. Climate change and the way it threatens the lives of the most vulnerable ought to be a critical focus of scholarship, thought, speech, and action in our field. I want us to mark this time, this day, this moment, and say, here we stopped, and here we started. But what would make you stop? What would interrupt you? 2, being interrupted. What do I mean by interruption? The idea of interruption is about both betweenness, inter, and brokenness, rupture. To interrupt is to stop the continuous process of action, to stop someone speaking, to break the continuity of a line, or to block a view. To be a being is to be a being living in the illusion of a life that is a continuous, busy process. We are committed to continuity, to historicity, to plans and prospects, to the order of things, their repetitions and patterns and sequences. We expect, rather touchingly, that we live in a consistent, progressive narrative, and that the interruption of being is a break in the story that we want to resume. We've made promises, we've bought tickets, we have a book contract. We need quiet for our mindfulness and not that noisy kid. We resent interruption because of this narrative ideal that we have an important product to produce, even if that product is some little unit of reflection. And to be interrupted is to be taken, to be snatched from our work to some other call. To be interrupted is to be broken. It is to have one's view blocked by something one does not want to see, the beggar, to have one's professing, one's declaration, one's own story stopped, a disagreement perhaps, or someone calling out for help, a question orthogonal to your own. If we are to understand the character of our being as temporal, if we're to create a theory that can respond decently to the question of how ought we to live in a world that is burning, it must be a theory that emerges out of our actual praxis, not our fantasy narrative of pristine journey. The arc of the universe does bend towards justice, we learned from Martin Luther King, but it is not an unbroken line. Our pulling makes cracks and fissures. We live in the space between the ruptures. The world as we know it is not flat, yet it is altogether flattened into a series of ceaseless falsities, and in their quotidian necessity make us despair. It is a world of totality, and we tell ourselves a story of seamless desire, each little event, each little trial, each little flattery, presenting as if we were the only one in the room with our particular victory just ahead. Here is what it means to be modern. We believe that everything can be under control, ordered in advance, the costs and benefits weighed up. But into our lives, and utterly out of our control or our will, comes the complete otherness of interruption. Is it a surprise that we understand interruption as a problem, the distraction of being within a world of necessary order, the chaos of the otherness of being, all that is not self knocking at the door, all that is not work come calling just when you're writing up your big idea. For what are we interrupted? There are the 1,000 small, serious interruptions. There are the questions of students and their needs. There's the constant interruption that goes by the name administration. There are the petty cascades of email, the sense of news constantly on a crawl beneath the actual work of our lives. There are the bodies that need ordinal tending, children, the old, everyone who needs us to look at their drawing, to attend to the wound, to lift them up in our arms now. For what are we interrupted? For the grandest dramas and the greatest joys, for the befallenness of illness, the birth of children, for true love, for desperate need. There is the praxis of interruption, and if you are a moral being, you will have done well to be a being who is broken off, one who is stopped. This is so vividly true about our lives that it is obvious but unseen, something we know when no one asks us, something we need to remind ourselves of, the task of moral philosophy. 3, interruption is theology. We're interrupted by the insistent call of God, and when we respond rightly, it is to prayer. It is action for the widow and the orphan. It is standing and saying, Hineni, here I am. I am here, but yet it is hard to respond rightly, and from this we flee in terror, not as moderns to be sure, into fish or Tarshish or desert, but into work, meetings, Netflix, grant applications. In my field, bioethicists, we seek out ever more unlikely cases or consider obscure fears about improbable technologies, all the places we like to go when we're in flight. We are in flight, and the world is tiny, distant, and far away. It is George Bush staring at Katrina, that first great climate disaster, from his airplane window, and we know that gaze because it is our own. We are in flight, even people who know better, people who actually read the prophets. We're off to metaphysical caves. Who wants this interruption, this reminder, this politics? A theology of interruption demands we attend to the interruption as if the interruption were the real, and the other stuff of our lives, the distraction. How to live such a theological ethics, an attention to the call of the other, and alert always to the call of God without seeming like a madwoman or a religious fanatic? What would such a life look like? Well, for a Jew, of course, there is Shabbat, made ever more utter a stop in time because of the constancy of the machines we admire and pet and constantly speak into. In that interruption, we turn only to one another, to Torah, to the grammar of prayer. Now, that's perhaps too romanticized a version, for we also eat and complain, but it's not a trivial act in modernity to make a Shabbat as a sign to honor the interruption. And for any reader of Hebrew scripture, there is the commanded interruption of the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year, the year of release, when every 6 years all agricultural work stops, the fields are left fallow, and every living creature, animal, and person can eat from the field and the vineyard and the wide open world, when the boundaries of ownership and possession are broken, and the poor can take what they need, when all debts are released. It's a practice that's not metaphysical, but describes an actual theopolitical economy taking place in force this year, 5775, a sabbatical year in Israel. These acts of praxis, the acts of attention within lived communities of faith, these interruptions are signifiers that each of us, a people in actual places and standing next to actual others, can act, even partially, even briefly, as if she hears something, someone, as if something that is not sold, not quantitatively measured or advertised, matters. To interrupt your life is a theological claim. Let me argue that the texts of many scriptures, surely Hebrew scripture, the New Testament, and the Quran, are written as a kind of an argument, with in-between narratives and lacuna and ruptures and people speaking back, leaving room for centuries of responsa and fierce public fights and our academic scholarship. As scriptural readers, there are the texts in which narrative after narrative, the given stable hierarchies of power, the natural order of the empirical world, the dark and steady pull of cultural customs, even the sequence of story is interrupted. I'll have some examples. There's so many in the Torah. First, the great flood text that I just asked you to consider, and the pivotal story of Avraham, who interrupts, according to Rashi, the medieval commentator, a conversation with God to attend to the 3 strangers who show up hungry at his tent, and the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. For the rabbis of the Talmud, the question of interruption is one of fascinated concern. In repeated and different and prolonged discussions, the rabbis debate when interruption is permitted, on the Shabbos, on public reading of Torah, on a vow, on study or prayer. Interruption is, of course, the very method of teaching and learning and ethical decision-making in Jewish thought, and one interrupts with story on story on story. Perhaps a life lived in the midst of interruption is exactly the point of such a rabbinic discourse. Consider the scene of the greatest interruption in rabbinic literature. One day, the house of study was suddenly open to all, to everyone, to the poor, the ugly, the uncertain, and a great interruption of hierarchy of learning that was the very center of Jewish life after the Roman destruction of the Second Temple. And here's a lesson about an enormous interruption. On that day, the rules of the language game and the admission standards of the rabbinic study hall were upended. On that day, the halls of the academy were open to everyone. So many came, was it 400 or 700? Despite the shocked response of Rabbi Gamaliel, the wealthy putative leader, an entire tractate of the Talmud is created that day, and every question of the law was answered with certainty, the closest thing to a miraculous event for Jews. Even the terms of race are undone. An Ammonite can enter the house of study, for colonialization has interrupted fixed biological lineages, insists this text. Gamaliel goes to ask for forgiveness. He has not fully understood the depths of these changes and the terrible poverty And when he does this, he goes to Rabbi Joshua, who works at the most desperate of jobs, burning wood into carbon, making charcoal. And the story ends with a critical claim about study itself, that teachers must understand the lives of the poor and interrupt their profession and study with these facts. Look at the blackened walls of the houses of the poor. Learn from the poorest. The passion for interruption on behalf of the poor continues in later medieval texts, where prayer can be interrupted for a claim of justice. In this 9th century text of interruption, the leadership of the Ashkenazi community, deep within the long exile in Western Europe, hears a case and decides the matter. But the man or the woman who is the subject of the decision is unhappy, and she is determined, even when no one in power will listen to her, to challenge it. So she can take her claim to the synagogue and interrupt the prayer to demand, "Listen to me." This is a remarkable moment in Jewish law, a method by which a judgment can be challenged by an interruption in a holy place of a holy act. What is suggested is an astonishing moral gesture, especially given the elaborate rabbinic limits on interruption of the communal speech act of prayer. But clearly there's a tension between prayer and the needs of others. In this medieval text, it is suggested that the act of justice, the interruption of justice, is also a part of the service. It's a radical claim, but it's a clear echo of the day of the great interruption in the Talmud. Attend to the situation of the poor, see her. 5, acts of interruption. What do narratives and practice tell us about how to be good, about the worth of our lives in a burning time? Why do the rabbis worry about interruption and its protection? And why do I say you must interrupt your life? To be interrupted is to acknowledge the power of the other over your being, to see the interrupting, messy, needy other as entitled to your full attention. But because we do not have a clear account of how one ought to live as a good person at a time of climate chaos, and because full attention is so hard, we struggle to defend what looks like a series of affections or hobbies. Is there a way to articulate a foundational theory behind actions of this sort? To argue for the need for interruption is to advocate for a moral chronology. We are beings who not only live in particular locations, we live within a time that we order and sort another sort of accountancy. How we order time, how we understand ourselves as having a past that leads to a present that promises a future is always an interpretive moral choice, albeit one that seems to us utterly invisible and given. The clearest advocate for this recognition is Walter Benjamin, who alerts us to how we see time, how we experience it as empty space along which we endlessly travel, aligns us with a sort of secular passivity. Progress, economic growth, more units of things, the storm catches up our desires and our stuff. Benjamin sees that empty time as a homogeneous continuum of moments which have no goal and finally no subject. This sort of time has to be arrested. The thinking that it enables, indeed necessitates, has to be interrupted. How unlike the radical breaks of religious texts, the sun that stops in the center of the sky, the prophets who unmake history and its narrative of subjugation. How unlike the Jewish view of time, Benjamin argues, where every second was the straight gate through which the Messiah entered. Empty time colludes with institutions that say, it's always been like this is impossible to change. It creates people who only yearn for things to say precisely like they have always been. And yet we know that sustaining a world of endless, repeated injustice and always unthinking movement ahead is problematic. Argues Benjamin, uninterrupted time expels any substantive expectation and thus engenders that fatalism which eats at the souls of modern women and men. That fatalism, that acceptance. But time can be interrupted at any point by redemption. An exodus can begin, a slavery end, a bush can burn, a Messiah can be revealed at the gates of the city, hanging around with the lepers. This is not only a Jewish assertion. Our late AAR President Otto Madura argued from this podium, Scripture calls us to live as if at any moment we could be surprised, awed, ready to rise to action and to grace, ready to welcome the Messiah, ready to appear to one another in public, because our interruption could alter what we have come to think of as the course of history. Moral chronicity is an account of interruption as cessation and redirection, and of ourselves as moral agents with the capacity to be ready. The premise, then, is larger than acting well as an individual. For I am responsible for my neighbor's pledge, reminds Levinas, responsible for her responsibility. We act in this manner not out of fear of the future, although any rational person after this weekend should at this point be quite sobered by the scientific accounts. The premise is that interruption of time, in the sense that Benjamin meant, leads to the creation of a sort of person with the virtues to which we aspire, but also to an argument that might convince others. And it is that sort of person that is capable of being a moral citizen. The storm is coming, and religion is not a discipline of engineers. All we have is words and the capacity to think, as Hannah Arendt insists. We must think quite clearly now about our situation. To perform ethics, is to think about how to be good. All the complex work we do, all the research, is to know the story of how people struggled, spoke, wrote, and heard of the question, how can I live a good life? Now, how ought I to live when the world is burning? How to reclaim this sort of thinking from stupid trivialities or caricature? One way might be to avoid the easy tropes, both the rainbow promises and the apocalyptic threats. But the one I want to suggest is to think about interruption as an ethical choice, based on the actualities of our human lives, lives in this time when always, always there is a knock at the door, and despite all our fears, to be good is to open that door and welcome the stranger. Thinking about interruption, the stopping, the hearing, leads to thinking about hospitality, the act of speech and welcome. Because climate change transforms the world, there will be exile and there will be strangers on the move. We must think about welcome, and we must stop, get up, and make the move to answer, for we are the only ones left, and this, our home, it is the last place for the traveler, for us. So, a theology of interruption as an ethics for the coming storm, but now what do I do? 3 ways we can interrupt, as individuals, citizens, and scholars. First, we must think and then act as individuals. It will not be enough, and when we act as individuals with our little ordinal choices, it will feel futile against the scale of icebergs and 1,000-year floods. It is true that the scale of our individual action, and even if every one of us refuses meat, abandons our car, insulates and light bulbs and recycles, it will not be enough. But how are we to live unless we stop, one by one, and stand like objects of resistance, like interruptions in the flow of the river of history, breaking the rushing lines and disrupt? If I don't, who do I imagine will? There are many reasons to act beyond the calculation of benefit or payoff, of course. We are shaped by our acts, our bodies, our homes, our organizations. And one reason we act is to create a life worth living, a life of meaning and courage. This act of stopping will shape me, and the act of unthinking consumption, that will shape me too. I'm a Californian, and I grew up in a curl of the Pacific coast, a cove called La Costa, which means the home, where the sea has risen and the storms are newly terrible and the rocks are now bleached acid white. Each time I act from my home, and this is true for each one of us. What I do, how I live, is a moral act, every single gesture. And while the gestures seem innocent, they are cumulative, and they set in motion a chain of action that, given the structures of exchange, is part of the systemic order of the world. And that world is so shaped, the production and the exchange and consumption and the goods, that the wealthiest have garnered the vast majority of wealth and burned the vast majority of carbon at the expense of the lives and the health of the poor. We are the sort of creatures with a plight into which we are each born, which is that we cannot not act. There is no doing nothing. There is no doing nothing, for the doing of nothing is a something, is a moral act, one in which you support the existing constructs of carbon use and the policies of the energy companies, and it looks for all the world like you are then acting as if you have a duty to them, the one that you enact every time you get into their car. Second, we must think and then we must speak as citizens. For Hannah Arendt, the public speech, the speech to one another which disturbs and breaks into the power of totality, is both political and ontological. It is the act of civil disobedience that creates the institutions of a larger democracy. Consent, freedom, all of this is contingent on the fact that we could protest. We could enter the event of the polis. We could speak to stop it. The reverse is, of course, also the case. If we don't speak, if we don't stop, then we partake of what is being said. We sustain the givenness of this order, an order so convenient for us, so terrible for too many, terrible one by one in too many places, child by child. Can you not hear them at your door? Let me expand this idea of civil interruption, that we must act as citizens in addition to acting as individuals. I'll turn to a distinction made by Arendt in her consideration of civil disobedience. Individual acts, she argues, Socrates' refusals and Thoreau's protests, while infinitely appealing, are ultimately subjective. Thoreau himself was pretty happy with his conscience being clear and his one day in jail when he refused to pay taxes to the state. And this was noble, but it was personal, and by the way, his buddies bailed him out and quietly paid the tax. Thoreau writes that we come into the world not chiefly to make it a good place to live, but to live in it well, be it good or bad. And Arendt understands the limits of Thoreau's personal choice this way. Indeed, this is how we all come into the world, lucky if the world and the part of it we arrive in is a good place at the time of our arrival. But what if it is a place where the wrongs committed are of such a nature that it requires you to be an agent of injustice, she asks. For if this is the case, then I say, break the law. This idea, this tension between being a good person and being a good citizen, between morality and politics, is as old as the idea of the state. Arendt notes, as old as the city in which Socrates teaches, the thinking person must think of the judgment of others and of the interior integrity of the self. But there is a problem with this strategy, and that is why if we only each recycle our cups and bike to work, we have not finished with our duties in this burning time. Ultimately, she argues, individual acts remain subjective and self-interested, like choices in the marketplace, hard to justify. Arendt wants more than the individual interruption. She wants public action. She wants civil disobedience, meaning organization. She wants minorities to band together, make a decision, and take a stand, and that's when the state can be changed, when the defiance of established authority can be the outstanding event, when persons act as citizens in the name of and for a group on the grounds of basic dissent, not as individuals. To be a citizen, to actually change things in a democracy, is to seize the deadly serious duty of continuing participation in all manners of public interest. This participation, this voice, this interruption of the business taking place in the public square, this is all that free people have. But we must act as if participation matters beyond a noble loneliness, and that requires a great deal from us, especially if we're the sort of citizens that are not used to thinking in this way, if we're the sort of scholars who are worried about being too political, who are willing to forgo, some comforts to be sure, but not entirely sure we want to risk what is so dear to us, our work, our profession, our professing to do well politics. Third, we must think and then teach as scholars of religion. For doesn't the question of the other, the one who has not arrived in a lucky place, emerge from our own scholarship? Isn't that the point of knowing that the stranger, widow, and orphan are at the door, that the mendicant needs alms, that the land needs a year of release? We must live as if we're ready, say the texts we teach. We must live as if we were chosen to uphold the law, to be the persons who come in love, who ask even about the city of Saddam. Who will do this if not the teachers that we are? Letting the danger and the power and the endless mercy of religion to be excellently told is the task of the scholar of religion. To teach religion excellently is to engage in the public examination of things, the task of the scholar since Socrates spoke this truth to his academic, Notre. And our teaching, if it is actually parrhesia, should raise the questions that will doubtless interrupt the usual way of things, which in our academy would mean the disruption of the institutions that govern us, the ratio and the episteme of the marketplace, a marketplace devoted to continuous expansion, whatever the cost. And finally, we have a duty of scholars that emerges from the blunt fact that in scriptural texts we think are important. The point is made over and over again: your moral activities can affect the rain, the harvest, and the health of everything you love. The link between moral choices and material outcomes is made continuously, and it is received and studied towards a normative action. The text suggests the interruption of desire, of consumption, and of acquisition. They link that interruption to the order of the natural world of harvest time and planting. Our scholarly behavior is a part of this, for unless we see the world of the charcoal burner, our work will be lacking. 7, what can I do to interrupt your life? To pull you over and make you attend to this crisis? There's nothing I could possibly say to anyone who reads the daily news that does not already know, except this: we must be interrupted, we must stop. To make the future possible, we need to stop what we are doing, what we are making, what we are consuming, what we think we need, what makes us comfortable. We need to interrupt our work, even our good work here, to attend to the urgency of this question. For it is the one that needs a coherent answer, an answer we do not yet have. Is our society unable to stop careening towards the deep trouble of the coming storm because we have not fully attended, because we just can't stop? Listen to the language of the latest IPCC report. The mass die-offs of forests, the melting of land ice around the world, an accelerating rise of the seas that is leading to coastal flooding, heat waves devastating crops, and killed tens of thousands of people, all happening already. Not a generation from now, but now. The scenes of flooding are familiar if you live in the wake of Hurricane Sandy or the hurricane that wiped out thousands of the Philippines islands, but they're familiar also and resonant to scholars of religion as well. We know the language of flood. So let me turn to the text that I started with that you just studied. Genesis 6:5 begins as if in the middle of the story, in despair, the thoughts of the heart of a watching God. And he saw that all the very imaginations of the heart of humans are nothing but evil every single day. So much evil by the humans, the earth, and every shape of being. And he regretted that he made the humans. He grieved to the very heart of him. And he said, I will erase the humans who I created from off the faces of the ground, from human to beast to every moving animal, and to the flyer of the heavens that flies. I regret that I made them. The very earth, his last place, she is ruined, says he who regrets in the text. She is ruined by men. It is done in front of his face, mipanim, violently. And look, even I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy every living, breathing being from under heaven. Everything in the earth will die. Now in the Quran, there's a chance, a warning, an invitation to truth. We sent Noah to his people and said to him, warn thou thy people ere they come on them an afflictive punishment. And he said, O my people, indeed I am to you a clear warner. Worship Allah, fear him, obey me. It is not only Abrahamic texts that tell a story of a vast flood that destroys some great wickedness or chaos, but in Gilgamesh, in Plato, in the Theology of the Boeotia, in the Irish story of the Caser, in the Finnish Kalevala, in the Kawawe, Mabuti, Maasai, and Yoruba narratives. In India, the flood is told. In China, it's called the Gangyo. In Malaysia, the Kalav. For Thais, Kon Baram. There is a great flood told by the Hopi, the Mayan, the Incas. In Chile is Tretan Velu. In Peru, a flood and a rainbow and the waters running out in the huge waterfalls of Bogota. Let me be frank, in the tradition of the Hebrew Bible, it's not a happy or redemptive tale. And after the catastrophe, the narrative ends exactly as it began, with God watching the words Belavo in his heart, I won't kill the living beings as I did. We're left with the faintest of hope, a rainbow that vanishes, that barely lasts until we turn. A few lines later, the prophet Noah, naked and drunk and silent, and a world which will continue endlessly, ceaselessly, and without interruption, wrapped in its own spiral, until all of the days of the earth, seed and harvest and cold and warmth and summer and winter and day and night, no, they shall not cease, lo Shabbato. And this world, full of tempted, broken people, where not even childhood is innocent, is the one in which we live. It is not Eden. We who believe in science believe in this, that the carbon thrown into the cycle of summer and winter will cause a spiral in predictable, unceasing physical realities of this last place. The word will not cease in Hebrew is lo Shabbato, Shabbat meaning to actively stop, as opposed to just resting. Shabbos actively ceases the marketplace exchanges, all the frenetic mechanical action of the world, all the digital zinging, all the traveling, all the writing, all the finishing of things into other things. One interrupts the natural order, the ceaseless cycle to cease, to make an in-between, rupting or breaking, break the 6-day week and make a Shabbat, an event that's exactly not in the natural order. The people are commanded from Sinai, and every 6 years, break the bounds to the field and seed time and harvest time, and make a stop for justice, make a sabbatical year. This Shabbat is a task of humans, and it is a moral choice, this active Shabbato. And we humans, we need to stop. We can make an argument to stop and start, to understand the link from behavior to the turning world. But it will take the sort of argument that is made in the many, many flood stories. There is a moment just before the flood when it could be otherwise. Listen to the prophet's warning, say the texts. Allow even a corner of goodness to survive, and the world could be otherwise then erased. We could stop here, attentive, thinking. 8, what time is it? Let me say a word about why what I'm asking is so hard. To be present in your place, hineni, to God's asking, where are you, is not only the event of attendance. We understand, and how could we not with our Google Maps and our PDAs, where we are. We feel like we can own and possess place and territory, but we are uncertain where we are in our time, when it is that we exist. We say we don't have the time, sorry. We do not have the time, and we cannot grasp it. And we think if we have forever, we have at least 60 years or so. It's this essential miscalculation that is the point. As Ban Ki-moon noted November 2nd, science has spoken. There is no ambiguity about the message. Time is not on our side. We think that the great interruption of climate change is an event of the far future, and look, we're busy. We are worried about ISIS and Ebola and tenure committees and the poor in our own cities, and actually tenure committees. We think that while we need to play the long game, after all, what's religion if not the long game, we can think about the issue like some other time. And here is the fundamental problem. For the climate has already changed. As the IPCC has told us yesterday, time is not on our side. The report contained the group's most explicit warning yet about food supply. Intensified weather conditions have left poor people worse off. That has already happened. Why can this occur in our faces, this hunger, and yet we still do not stop? We worry about missing lunch for this talk. Why, knowing everything we know, having proof texts and data, do I still act without real urgency? A few months ago, speaking to my son about the terrible paradox of evil people flourishing, rewarded for greed or for simple carelessness, he reminded me of one rabbinic argument that evil people have no share in Olam Haba, the world that will come. And I told him I thought this argument was entirely unconvincing, overly pious. But in fact, my doubts about Olam Haba, my modern's lack of simple faith in a cosmic system of reward and punishment, is a symptom of a far larger issue. Because there's something else that makes it easy to flee from our duty as we confront climate chaos. I think we find it impossible as moderns who live in the always present to imagine our own death. Our version of climate denial is about our own denial of our death. Only a distortion this central to the event of our being could possibly explain why us rational scholars, rational political leaders, even rational capitalists can act as we act, as if the good American life will be stable, as if we did not have to stop in our tracks. Why is our denial of death a particular problem in this catastrophe? The inability to imagine an afterlife is linked to our inability to imagine a life after us, any sort of world to come. If we cannot confront the facticity of our own death, and we cannot then imagine a time in which we're not going to be here in our present with our stuff and our loves, our temperature controlled, our airline travel, our oceans nicely in their place, then we cannot possibly imagine a world that our grandchildren will face. But we must imagine it, for if not, they will face it alone, stunned by the thought that if we had acted as if we were mortal moral agents, we could have made it better. The world, the coming one, is a place we already see if we look, but only if we look at the lives of the most marginalized, the border dwellers, the women on the ridges of the sand in Bangladesh, the Chinese herders in the great dust storm, at the men who burn charcoal to sell. But we cannot see them if the world is full of, well, me and my immortal continuing happiness. So we flee, I flee, we are fleeing. We are trying to outrun the coming storm. But colleagues, we do not have to run. We can stand in our place, in this place, and in our research, our teaching, and our academic citizenship. We can claim our power. Let me explain. Religions, we who excellently study them, have many liabilities and in too many ways have made some things, well, worse. But we might agree that religions have at least 4 powerful capacities. First, religions do confront the enormous terror of each of us as we face death, with narratives that allow us to imagine our good life as part of a larger story in which we are mortal and broken and old and yet beloved. Second, religions allow ordinary people to believe in their own power to change unjust situations and, despite all odds and everything arrayed against them, to change them. This idea of the beauty and crystalline brilliance of action, of the value of compassion and repentance, and of the power of humility is so unlike the tropes of our American culture, and frankly, our academic culture as well, that it's hard to even teach it. But it's a vivid truth of our texts and our traditions. There is power here, dangerous and vivid. It is the power to see the most ordinary, the smallest, the most degraded one, the remnant, the lost, the desperate, hungry stranger as your sister standing next to you at Sinai, as the center of the teeming world. Religious language fights for values beyond the marketplace exchange. It holds the last lost tongue of justice. Third, religious traditions allow for prophecy, to imagine the future, to call for repentance, to see a day coming that can be imagined, changed, redeemed. All of this is possible. The road to the impossible is open. Calling and wild, or rational with the charts and the PowerPoints, come now the activists and the scientists. Comes the guy in the lab coat, the farmer. And if you teach religious studies, you will know them as prophets. And within the traditions that attend to dreamers, they can be heard. And fourth, religions are without borders. Just like medicine can be sans frontières, religions allow us to consider ourselves to be global members of covenants far deeper and far broader than national boundaries. Religions are often strongest in the places where the climate is worse, the global south, where the land lies close to the sea and where clean water is a day's walk away. Understanding the borderless nature of the problem is the first step towards solidarity. As scholars of religion, we understand we may see the words of desperate warning burned or discarded by the powerful who deny a link between moral behavior and the actual world. We know what it is to walk in Nineveh and despair of change, or to be the smartest outsider in the king's court, the ones who are taught to speak Chaldean or science or politics, to be the interpreter of the terrifying dreams of the future. We know what it is to speak against the marketplace and the soldier's order. As scholars who read the texts that show how a human life might be lived in view of God, we are used to disbelief and used to the idea that religion is trivial, religion is naive, or simply unrealistic. All we have is words. We have no armies, only graduate students, colleagues. All we can do is teach, to act as moral agents, to live out our words. We make a living by struggling to understand the truth of this world, by speaking parrhesia. And here it is important to note that we do like hard inquiry, and we believe in skepticism, but we do not believe in ignorance, and we don't support the denial of data because we're teachers. We live in a time, we teach at a time, when religions are in the center stage of history. They've marched into the center stage of history, and in the center of the stage, they enact and speak. Of course, because all real moral agency is based on the concept that real deep evil is a possible choice, enacted there is both peace and violent war, both attention to the climate and the display of wealth and power that destroys the climate. The moral gesture of teaching and of working at a university is not an innocent gesture, for we still live as Americans using 3 times the resources of most. We still get to fly to San Diego and take it over, living in hotels far above the beggars, eating and drinking and swimming in what we call work, but is laughably more than the dreams of most of the people of this world. Just ask the woman who cleans the toilets in your department, or the man who sweeps the sidewalks of your pretty campus. And we'll fly home, leaving the white trail of our carbon streaking and crossing the sky, filling it up this much more. We must stop, and we must start to support the peacemakers and the climate protectors and the life sustainers. If you care about the lives of the poor, you need now to care about the climate. If you care about women, if you care about the Middle East, if you care about children, you need to care about the climate. You need to say, this is what we are thinking about, this world to come. Do not think for a minute that we are powerless. We teach in one of the central institutions of American life, the university. Our science colleagues are already in motion. Our engineering colleagues are already working. We need to join them to produce the research that describes this moment. We need to reflect on the texts of crisis and collective action, to evoke resources for cultural and political change, and to be sure that the one great foe of even the most apolitical scholar, ignorance, is defeated. What time is it? Let that question interrupt you. Here's what they're saying. The time is right now. So, conclusion. Because I'm not the kind of ethicist that merely describes the issues or throws up her hands to say, gee whiz, that's really awful. As Karen Lebach warned me in graduate school at GTU, we must make real decisions in this actual world. So finally, we must think and work as scholars of the AAR. So here are some pragmatic signs and acts at the AAR at scale, 2 ways we can stop and then start: tithing and sabbatical year. First, tithing. Let science interrupt you, and tithe enough time to respond. In every speech and in every class, make a little room for this problem. Not the whole semester. You can still do your exegesis or describe the lived religious practices of the Brooklyn Catholics, or translate that last rare copy of the 15th century Vietnamese manuscript. But make some corners in your field, in our field of scholarship, a time tithe. 10 minutes of attention about the very real need to think about our climate. Tithe, say, 1 week a semester, or tithe 4 hours from weekly email to read 1 IPCC report, 1 book about the issue. Study the science, teach the consequences. Tithing could be an ongoing part of our annual meeting, making the AAR a transformative community. We could each take, for example, 2 hours off of our meeting and leave a project in our wake: 1 garden, new trees, every place we've been. And 2, we need to think of and for the group, for we are 10,000 people, the size of a small city, and we have the power of speech. This is a problem of collective action, the biggest problem we've ever faced as a species, and it can seem utterly overwhelming, but we can make the decisions at the AAR scale. And here's one idea from my Jewish tradition, I hope a good one among the many that will emerge in our annual meeting. If we can't make this meeting neutral, carbon neutral, we could create an AAR sabbatical year. So what do I mean? It means that once in every 6 years, we could just pause. Following the biblical cycle, we could choose not to meet at a huge annual meeting in which we take over a city. Every year, each participant going to the meeting uses a quantum of carbon that is more than considerable. Air travel, staying in hotels, all of this creates a way of living on the earth that is intensely carbon intensive, and it could be otherwise. What if instead of coming together, we could spread out over the land, as it were, and read out papers to one another at our own universities, where we could meet each of us in our own city and turn to the faces and needs of our fellow citizens? What if, on that day, we taught the poor in local high schools, community colleges, or the prison, the hospital, the military base, the church, mosque, synagogue, or temple at a place that is not your own, worked at planting an orchard or a garden, served food to the poor, offered our teaching, and offered to learn? What if we turned to our neighbor, the woman who cleans the toilets, the man who sweeps the sidewalks, and included them in the university to which we are responsible? We would then be actively making an interruption in our AAR lives, saying by this act, I will make a sacrifice that is serious to save my planet. I'm not suggesting, far from it, that we do this more than try this in 7 years when the sabbatical year comes again in 2021. We can then happily go back the other years. But remember, time is not on our side. And there will come a time, there will, in 7 or 14 or 21 or 28 years, when we will not be able to fly to this coast of California unless we radically change the course of history. If the AAR began a sabbatical year, others may follow. Perhaps other organizations, institutions, your universities, individuals could also say, no more flying for business or to give a climate talk, and that would be one very clear act, Shabbat, stopping. Of course, it's going to be really hard. And you might be thinking just about now, how hard, how costly, or as they say, how very inconvenient. But we have 7 years to figure this out all the details, and you are a very, very clever group of scholars. Do you want more government action? Think big business has not done enough? Then let us start with a dramatic and definitive action of our own. I do not know what other thoughtful answers might spring from religious scholars if we devote your full, serious research attention to the problem of climate change. This year, fully 1/3 of the sessions at the AAR meeting will address the crisis with a variety of methods, texts, and interrogations. This is a good beginning, but there must be far more. We must work harder. We must do all that we can to live an interrupted life, to live a life of moral attention. It is the first duty of the scholar. I wanted to be a president who took seriously the prophetic duty of my field, bioethics, to warn, to speak of the possibility of our power and our responsibility. Who interrupted you and told you to let the call of the stranger stop you in your tracks and the brokenness of the earth call you to action? I wanted to be the one who said to you, stop. Stop and start. And now, all of this world and this organization, and this, the greatest moral question of our time, it is completely in your hands. I know your power, and I know what we could do. And I want you to stand with me, and I want you to let us begin. Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to everyone. Thanks to my family, my mom, Helen Zoloth, who's standing there, right, schlepping Nakas, my favorite interrupters. Thank you, all of you. You know who you are who've helped me come to this point. Thank you, and do a good job. Thanks.